Hello, midnight wanderers, and welcome to Dreadvane. This is where ancient whispers rise beneath a crimson sky, carrying you softly into the world of dreams and shadows. Before tonight's haunting story begins, tell me, what corner of the world are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. And if the silence of the night calls to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell, so you'll never miss the moon's next dark secret. About 10 years ago, I had an experience that still doesn't make sense to me. I've gone over it in my head countless times, trying to come up with a reasonable explanation, but nothing has ever felt right. Even after all these years, I can still picture every detail of that night as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. At the time, I was driving home late after a long day. My route took me along a lonely highway in eastern Oregon, a stretch of road surrounded by open fields and rolling hills with almost nothing nearby. There weren't any towns for miles, and once the sun went down, the entire area became incredibly dark. If you've ever driven through rural eastern Oregon in the middle of the night, you know how isolated it feels. The only light comes from your headlights, and everything beyond them disappears into blackness. It was around 3 o'clock in the morning. The road was completely empty. I hadn't seen another vehicle for several miles, and there were no houses, gas stations, or businesses anywhere nearby. The only sounds were the steady hum of my engine and the tires rolling across the pavement. I wasn't struggling to stay awake. I wasn't distracted or exhausted. I felt completely alert. I was simply looking forward to getting home, climbing into bed, and finally getting some sleep. For several minutes, nothing unusual happened. Then, out of nowhere, my headlights illuminated someone standing on the shoulder of the road. At first, I thought it might be a construction worker or someone whose vehicle had broken down. The reflective strips on his high-visibility safety vest lit up brightly as my headlights reached him, making him stand out against the darkness. He wasn't walking. He wasn't waving for help. He was simply standing there. As I got a little closer, I noticed he was holding something in his arms. From a distance, it looked exactly like a small baby wrapped in a blanket. He gently rocked it back and forth as if he were trying to comfort a child. That immediately caught my attention. Who would be standing on the side of an empty highway at 3 in the morning holding a baby? There wasn't a single house nearby. There were no parked cars, no flashing hazard lights, and no signs that an accident had happened. Thinking someone might need help, I took my foot off the gas and slowed down. I started looking around for another vehicle or anyone else nearby. There was nothing, just one man standing alone on the gravel shoulder. As I got closer, I switched on my high beams to get a better look. The brighter light completely changed what I thought I was seeing. It wasn't a baby, it was a deer fawn. The small animal was clearly dead. Its body was covered with blood, and one of its legs hung awkwardly as the man slowly rocked it back and forth in his arms. For a second, I honestly couldn't believe what I was looking at. My mind struggled to process the image. Then I looked at the man's face. He wasn't looking down at the animal. He wasn't looking at my truck. He stared straight ahead with an empty expression, almost as if he didn't even realize I was there. A faint smile stretched across his face, but there was no warmth behind it. It wasn't a happy smile. It wasn't friendly. It looked completely emotionless. The thing that disturbed me the most was his eyes. They looked lifeless. There was no emotion, no curiosity, no fear, just a blank stare that somehow made the entire situation feel even more unsettling. As my truck passed him, our eyes met for only a brief moment. That single glance sent a chill through my entire body. Every instinct I had told me not to stop. Only seconds earlier, I had been thinking about pulling over to ask if he needed assistance. The moment I realized what he was holding, that thought disappeared completely. I pressed the accelerator to the floor and drove away as fast as I could. For the next several miles, I couldn't stop checking my rearview mirror. Part of me expected to see him standing in the middle of the road behind me. Another part kept wondering if I had somehow misunderstood what I had seen. But no matter how many times I replayed those few seconds in my head, the details never changed. I knew exactly what I had witnessed. Unfortunately, there wasn't much cell phone service in that area. I kept driving until I finally reached a spot where my phone picked up a signal. The first thing I did was call 911. I explained that I had just seen a man standing on the shoulder of the highway wearing a reflective safety vest. I told the dispatcher exactly where I had seen him and gave the closest mile marker I could remember. I also explained what he had been holding. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. The dispatcher sounded skeptical. Honestly, I couldn't blame them. Even saying the story out loud made it sound unbelievable. Still, they took down the information and said they would send a deputy to check the area. Later, I learned that officers searched the highway but didn't find anyone. There was no man, no dead deer, no evidence that anyone had been standing there. That somehow made the whole experience even stranger. Over the years, I've told this story to friends several times. Almost every person has offered a different explanation. Some think I must have briefly fallen asleep behind the wheel and dreamed the whole thing. Others believe I probably saw a strangely shaped trash bag or some kind of hunting equipment that my brain misunderstood in the darkness. A few have suggested I imagined the entire encounter because I was driving alone late at night. I understand why people look for a logical explanation. If someone else told me the exact same story, I'd probably try to explain it away too. The problem is that I know I wasn't asleep. I wasn't hallucinating. I remember slowing my truck because I genuinely believed someone needed help. I remember the reflective vest shining brightly in my headlights. I remember realizing the object wasn't a baby. Most of all, I remember those eyes. Even now, after all these years, that's the part I can't forget. I've driven thousands of miles since that night, including many lonely highways in the middle of the night. I've seen stranded drivers, injured animals, and plenty of strange things along the road. I've never seen anything remotely like that again. Maybe there is a completely reasonable explanation for what happened. Maybe I'll never know what I actually saw. All I know is that one lonely highway in eastern Oregon gave me a memory that has stayed with me ever since. Whenever I think back to that night, I don't remember the empty road first. I remember a man standing alone in the darkness, gently rocking what I first believed was a baby, only to realize it was a bloody deer fawn. And I remember the blank smile and those lifeless eyes staring into the darkness as if nothing else in the world existed. No matter how much time passes, that image is one I'll never forget. When I was a kid, I had an experience that stayed with me for years. Looking back now, I honestly think there was probably a perfectly reasonable explanation for it. Kids have incredible imaginations, and our minds can turn ordinary situations into unforgettable memories. Even so, every time I think about that day, I can still remember exactly how frightened I felt. At the time, I lived in a quiet neighborhood with a small stretch of woods directly across the street from my house. It wasn't a huge forest, but to a child, it felt enormous. The trees seemed taller than they probably were. The shadows looked darker, and once you walked in a short distance, it almost felt like you had left the neighborhood behind. My friends and I played there all the time. We built little forts from fallen branches, searched for interesting rocks, climbed over logs, and pretended we were exploring some giant wilderness. It was the kind of place where a child's imagination could easily take over. One afternoon, I wandered into the woods by myself. I don't remember having any particular reason for going there. I was probably just bored and looking for something to do. The weather was nice, and the woods felt peaceful. As I walked deeper between the trees, I picked up a long stick from the ground. Like most kids, I immediately started using it as a toy. For a while, I swung it through the air, pretending it was a sword. Eventually, I found a tree and began absent-mindedly hitting the trunk with the stick while making up imaginary adventures in my head. The only sounds around me were the tapping of the stick against the bark and the occasional birds singing somewhere above. Everything felt completely normal. After standing there for a little while, I happened to look up. That's when I saw him. Standing several yards away, partially hidden behind another tree, was a child. He wasn't moving. He was simply standing there, staring directly at me. At first, I was just surprised. I hadn't heard anyone walking through the woods. I hadn't noticed anyone nearby. It was as though he'd appeared without making a sound. The longer I looked, the stranger he seemed. He was completely pale, not just light-skinned. Pale, his skin looked almost unnaturally white, especially against the darker trees surrounding him. His head was completely bald. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't waving. He wasn't saying anything. He simply stood there, watching me. I remember noticing what he was wearing. He had on a red t-shirt with the logo from my elementary school printed across the front. He was also wearing blue shorts. Everything about his clothes looked completely ordinary. It was the child himself who seemed unusual. At the time, I couldn't understand why another kid would just stand there silently watching me without saying anything. If he had been another student from school, why wasn't he talking? Why wasn't he asking what I was doing? Why wasn't he playing? Instead, he remained perfectly still. Looking back now, I honestly think there are countless reasonable explanations. Maybe it really was another kid who happened to be walking through the woods. Maybe he was shy. Maybe he was just as surprised to see me as I was to see him. Maybe the lighting made his skin appear much paler than it actually was. Children often shave their heads for medical reasons, personal choice, or because of sports. There are dozens of ordinary possibilities. But when you're a young child standing alone in the woods, your mind doesn't immediately search for logical answers. It reacts with emotion first. And in that moment, I was terrified. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. We simply stared at each other across the trees. I kept waiting for him to say something. He never did. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He didn't even take a step toward me. That silence somehow made the situation much scarier than if he'd actually spoken. Finally, my fear took over. I didn't ask who he was. I didn't try to talk to him. I didn't wait another second. I turned around and ran. I sprinted as fast as I could through the woods toward the road. Branches brushed against my arms as I pushed through them, and I didn't look back once. My only thought was getting out of the woods as quickly as possible. Within moments, I reached the street, crossed back toward my house, and didn't stop running until I was safely inside. Once I caught my breath, I kept replaying the image in my mind. The pale face, the bald head, the bright red school shirt, the silent stare. At the time, it felt like one of the creepiest things I'd ever experienced. As I grew older, though, I started looking at the memory differently. The older I became, the more I realized how powerfully a child's imagination can shape ordinary events. Children notice details differently than adults. Fear fills in missing information. A quiet stranger becomes mysterious. An ordinary expression becomes frightening. A few seconds can feel like several minutes. Memory itself also changes over time. We naturally remember the emotions of an event much more vividly than every small detail. Today, I genuinely believe there was probably nothing supernatural about what happened. It was most likely another child standing in the woods for reasons I'll never know. Maybe he was nervous. Maybe he was lost in thought. Maybe he was simply watching another kid play with a stick before deciding to leave. Whatever the explanation, my younger self interpreted the entire situation very differently. Fear has a way of transforming ordinary moments into unforgettable memories. Even now, whenever I walk through quiet woods, I sometimes think about that afternoon. I can still picture the child standing silently behind the tree, wearing a red shirt with my elementary school's logo and blue shorts, doing nothing except watching me. I don't think he ever intended to scare me. In fact, he may have been just as confused by seeing me as I was by seeing him. But to a young kid alone in the woods, that silent stare was enough. I ran without asking questions, and although I can laugh about it now, I don't think I'll ever completely forget the feeling I had when I looked up and realized someone had been standing there, quietly watching me the whole time. I grew up in a very old house that had been built sometime in the 1800s. It had a lot of history behind it, although I never knew every detail about the people who had lived there before us. From the outside, it looked like a beautiful old home with plenty of character. But living there always felt a little different from living anywhere else, whether it was because of the house's age or simply because old homes make strange noises. There was always an unsettling atmosphere that was hard to ignore. The floors creaked constantly. The old wooden walls expanded and contracted with changes in temperature. The plumbing made odd sounds in the middle of the night. As a kid, I tried to convince myself that every strange noise had a perfectly normal explanation. Still, there were moments when the house felt unusually quiet, almost as if it were waiting for something. Over the years, I experienced enough strange incidents that I eventually stopped trying to explain every single one. Looking back, I honestly don't know whether the house was actually haunted, or whether my imagination filled in the blanks because of how old and eerie the place felt. Whatever the truth was, there are plenty of memories from that house that still give me chills. Out of all of them, one experience has stayed with me more than any other. I was a teenager at the time. One afternoon, I had the entire house to myself. My parents were out, and nobody else was home except for our family cat. I don't remember exactly what I was doing. I was probably playing video games or watching television in the living room, just enjoying the quiet afternoon. Everything felt completely ordinary. After a while, I got up to grab a drink or maybe use the bathroom. It wasn't anything unusual. I simply walked down the hallway like I had done thousands of times before. Then, without any warning, I heard the loudest crash I've ever heard inside that house. The sound came directly from the basement. It wasn't one object falling. It sounded like absolute chaos. The only way I can describe it is this. Imagine walking into a fully stocked workshop filled with shelves, tools, glass jars, paint cans, and boxes. Now imagine someone becoming furious, grabbing the entire workshop and throwing everything onto a concrete floor all at once. That's exactly what it sounded like. Glass shattering, metal tools crashing together, paint cans slamming against concrete, heavy objects falling over, wood breaking. The noise was unbelievably loud. It sounded as though every single item in the basement had been thrown across the room at the same time. The entire house seemed to shake from the impact. For a split second, I just stood there frozen. Then my mind immediately jumped to the most logical explanation. Our cat. I assumed the cat must have climbed onto something unstable and somehow knocked over an entire shelf. The crash had been so violent that I became convinced the poor animal had been trapped underneath whatever had fallen. Without thinking, I sprinted toward the basement. My heart was pounding as I rushed down the stairs. I expected to find complete destruction. Broken glass everywhere. Shelves collapsed. Paint spilled across the floor. Maybe even my injured cat hiding somewhere underneath the mess. Instead, nothing. Absolutely nothing. The basement looked exactly the way it always had. Every shelf was standing upright. Every tool remained hanging where it belonged. The paint cans were still neatly lined up. Nothing had fallen. Nothing had broken. Nothing was out of place. I stood there staring in complete disbelief. I slowly walked around the basement, checking every corner. There wasn't a single object on the floor that shouldn't have been there. No shattered glass. No scattered tools. No overturned boxes. Nothing. The silence was almost as unsettling as the crash itself. I couldn't understand how such an enormous noise could leave absolutely no evidence behind. Still trying to make sense of it, I called for the cat. There was no answer. For a brief moment, I wondered if the cat had somehow run upstairs after causing the noise. So I searched the house. Eventually, I found our cat peacefully sleeping upstairs in another room. The cat hadn't even been in the basement. In fact, judging by how deeply asleep it was, it probably hadn't moved at all. That completely destroyed the only explanation I'd managed to come up with. After that, I went back downstairs one more time. I carefully inspected every shelf. I looked behind storage boxes. I checked the workbench. I even looked for tiny signs that something might have fallen and somehow been put back. There was nothing. Everything was exactly where it had always been. If I hadn't heard the crash myself, I would never have believed anything unusual had happened. The strange part wasn't just how loud the sound had been, it was how specific it sounded. It wasn't random noise. It sounded exactly like a workshop being completely destroyed. The individual sounds were incredibly clear. Glass breaking, metal clanging, heavy objects hitting concrete. Each one was distinct. It's one thing to hear a mysterious bang in an old house. Old houses settle. Pipes expand. Wood shifts. Those noises are normal. This wasn't anything like that. This sounded like complete destruction happening directly beneath my feet. Over the years, I've replayed that afternoon in my mind countless times. I've tried coming up with ordinary explanations. Maybe two objects somehow collided in a way that echoed strangely through the basement. Maybe a loud sound from outside somehow echoed through the foundation. Maybe my memory exaggerated the event over time. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that I reacted instantly because I genuinely believed something terrible had happened downstairs. I wasn't imagining vague noises. I was responding to what sounded like an entire room collapsing. Even now, just remembering that sound gives me goosebumps. It's strange how certain memories stay so vivid. I can still picture myself racing toward the basement stairs. I can still remember expecting to see complete chaos. And I can still remember the overwhelming confusion of finding everything exactly as it had been before. That old house gave me plenty of stories over the years. Some were easier to explain than others. But if someone asks me which experience has stayed with me the longest, it's always this one. Not because I saw anything unusual, not because I heard voices, not because objects moved on their own, simply because I heard what sounded like an entire basement being torn apart, and when I got there only seconds later, it looked as though nothing had happened at all. To this day, I still don't know what caused that sound. Maybe there was a perfectly ordinary explanation that I never discovered. Maybe old houses are capable of making noises that seem impossible. Or maybe it was one of those rare moments that simply refuses to fit into any explanation. Whatever it was, It's one memory I'll never forget. Even now, whenever I hear a loud crash somewhere in a house, part of me immediately expects to find a huge mess waiting on the other side. Thankfully, I always do. That old basement remains the only time I ever found complete silence, where total chaos should have been. One experience from my university years has stayed with me ever since. Even now, I don't know how to explain it. I've gone over it countless times, trying to find a logical reason for what happened. Maybe it was a strange coincidence. Maybe my brain briefly interpreted something incorrectly. I honestly don't know. But the timing of everything still unsettles me whenever I think about it. At the time, I was returning to university after spending some time away. I wasn't driving that day. Instead, I had arranged to get a ride with a few acquaintances who were already heading back to campus. The trip was fairly long, and we'd planned to leave earlier in the day. For some reason, though, our departure kept getting delayed. Every time I thought we were finally about to leave, someone would say we needed another few minutes. Then another delay. Then another. Nobody really explained why. At first, I assumed someone had forgotten to pack something, or was waiting for another family member. It didn't seem like my business, so I never asked any questions. Eventually, after waiting much longer than expected, we finally got into the car and started the drive back to university. The atmosphere inside the car felt quieter than usual. There was some casual conversation, but everyone seemed a little distracted. Again, I didn't think much of it. People have bad days. Sometimes long trips simply begin that way. About halfway through the journey, traffic was moving steadily, and I was looking out the passenger side window as cars passed us in the opposite direction. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular. I was simply watching the traffic go by. Then one passing car caught my attention. It happened in an instant. As the vehicle drew level with ours, I looked toward the driver. For the briefest moment, I saw something that made my heart stop. Instead of seeing the person's normal face, I thought I saw what looked like a death's head. Not literally a skull replacing their face, but something about their appearance instantly reminded me of death itself. The image lasted no more than a second. As soon as the car passed, it was gone. The reaction was completely automatic. I let out a loud gasp before I even realized I'd made a sound. Everyone inside our car immediately looked at me. "What happened?" someone asked. Without really thinking, I answered honestly. I just saw a death's head on the face of the person in that car. The words came out before I had time to consider how strange they sounded. The moment I finished speaking, the atmosphere inside the car changed completely. Nobody laughed. Nobody questioned what I'd said. Nobody even replied. The silence was immediate and absolute. I remember looking around, confused by everyone's reaction. I expected someone to joke about it or ask what I meant. Instead, every person in the car seemed suddenly uncomfortable. No one said another word for quite a while. At the time, I had absolutely no idea why. The rest of the journey continued in near silence. Eventually, we reached the university, unloaded our things, and went our separate ways. I didn't think much more about the strange moment. Honestly, I was more embarrassed than anything else. It sounded ridiculous even to me. I assumed everyone probably thought I'd imagined something or misinterpreted a quick glance through a passing window. The following day, I learned something that completely changed the way I looked at the previous afternoon. The father of the person who had been driving us had passed away. I was shocked. Then I learned another detail. The reason we'd left so much later than planned was because his father had been having serious health problems that day. The family had apparently spent hours deciding whether they should cancel the trip altogether or stay home. Eventually, they decided to leave. None of them had mentioned any of this to me. I hadn't known anything about his father's condition during the drive. That explained the strange mood inside the car. It explained the repeated delays before leaving. It explained why everyone had seemed distracted. Most of all, it explained the silence after I mentioned seeing what I described as a death's head. Only then did I realize how my words must have sounded to them. They were already worried about someone they loved. Then, without knowing anything about the situation, I suddenly blurted out something associated with death. Looking back, I feel terrible about that. The last thing I would ever want is to make someone's stressful situation even harder. If I'd known what was happening with his father, I never would have said anything. But at the time, I honestly believed I was simply describing something strange I thought I'd seen for a split second. After hearing the news, I kept replaying that moment over and over in my mind. Did I really see something unusual? Did my brain briefly misinterpret the person's face in the passing car? Was it nothing more than a coincidence that happened at an incredibly unfortunate time? I genuinely don't know. I've always tried to approach experiences like this with skepticism. The human brain can be remarkably unreliable. Our eyes only capture a fraction of the information around us. Sometimes we recognize patterns that aren't really there. Sometimes a quick glance becomes something much more dramatic once later events influence our memories. Those are all very real possibilities. In fact, they're probably the most likely explanations. Even so, I can't completely ignore how deeply the experience affected me. The image appeared for only a fraction of a second, yet it was vivid enough to make me gasp out loud without thinking. I've never reacted that way before. And I've never reacted that way since. Over the years, I've occasionally wondered whether I only connected the two events because of what happened afterward. If his father had recovered, I probably would have forgotten the entire incident within a day or two. Instead, the timing permanently linked those memories together. That's simply how human memory works. We naturally connect emotionally significant events. Maybe that's exactly what happened here. Whatever the explanation, it's still one of the strangest experiences of my life. I've never seen anything similar before. I've never looked at another person and had that same sudden impression, not once. And I sincerely hope I never do again. Whether it was an unusual coincidence, a trick of perception, or something my brain briefly created from an ordinary face seen through a moving car window, I'll probably never know. All I know is that one brief glance stayed with me. Not because I believe I predicted anything, but because the timing of what happened afterward made those few seconds impossible for me to forget. Even now, years later, I can still remember the silence inside that car after I spoke. At the time, I didn't understand it. The next day, I finally did. And it's a moment that stayed with me ever since. When I was about 8 years old, my family moved into my father's childhood home. It was an old house that had been in the family for years, and at first I was excited to live there. I didn't think much about its age or its history. To me, it was simply our new home. For the first few weeks, everything seemed perfectly normal. Then, little things started happening. My younger brother and I both began noticing shadows that didn't seem to belong to anything. Sometimes we'd catch something moving out of the corner of our eyes, only to turn around and find nothing there. Other times, we'd both get the strange feeling that someone else was standing nearby, even though we were completely alone. At first, we blamed our imaginations. We were kids. Kids scare themselves all the time. But those strange feelings kept happening often enough that they slowly became part of everyday life. Years passed, and eventually I started middle school. It was an exciting time because I also got my very first phone. Around that same period, something else changed. My sleep became incredibly light. I don't mean I slept a little less deeply. I mean the smallest noise could wake me up. If a plastic bag shifted slightly because of moving air, I would wake instantly. A tiny creak in the floor. A distant door closing. Almost anything was enough to pull me out of sleep. Before long, I developed another problem. I became terrified of sleeping in complete darkness. Eventually, I couldn't fall asleep unless the bedroom light stayed on all night. I knew it probably sounded childish, but I felt safer that way. One night, while sleeping with the light on, I had the experience that frightened me more than anything else I'd experienced up to that point. I was lying in bed, facing my bedroom door. At some point during the night, I suddenly became aware that I was awake. At least, I thought I was. I could clearly see my room. The light was still on. The furniture was exactly where it always was. Everything looked completely real. Then I realized I couldn't move. I tried lifting my arm. Nothing happened. I tried turning my head. Nothing. I tried calling for my parents. No sound came out. The harder I struggled, the more terrified I became. Then I looked toward the doorway. Standing there was a tall, dark figure. It wore what looked like a wide-brimmed hat. The figure seemed impossibly tall, almost taller than the doorway itself. It simply stood there, staring at me. What frightened me most wasn't just its appearance. It felt as though it knew I couldn't move, almost as though it was watching me struggle and enjoying it. I desperately tried screaming for my parents. Nothing happened. It felt impossible to breathe. The panic became overwhelming. I started crying while still unable to move. Finally, after what felt like forever, I managed to force myself awake. I sat upright in bed, crying uncontrollably. I was shaking so badly that I grabbed my new phone and called my father instead of walking to my parents' room. A few moments later, both of my parents came to check on me. My mother wasn't very happy about being woken up in the middle of the night. Looking back now, I understand why. From her perspective, it probably seemed like I had simply had a bad dream. At the time, though, it felt completely real. I had no idea what sleep paralysis was. That first experience was only the beginning. Over the next 8 years, I experienced sleep paralysis again and again. Sometimes the hallucinations changed. Sometimes I would wake unable to move, while dark human-shaped figures seemed to be lying beside me. Other times, I saw rats moving around the room. Once, I remember seeing what looked like a giant floating eye watching me from the darkness. Each episode felt incredibly realistic. In the beginning, every experience terrified me. Eventually, after so many episodes, I developed my own way of dealing with them. Instead of fighting whatever I thought I was seeing, I focused entirely on forcing myself awake. I learned that struggling against the hallucinations only made the fear worse. Little by little, I became better at recognizing when sleep paralysis was happening. Even though it was still frightening, I eventually stopped reacting with complete panic. Then something happened while I was fully awake that unsettled me even more. At the time, we had 2 dogs. One was a Labrador. The other was my little Bichon, who was my favorite. Normally, the Bichon wasn't allowed inside the house very often. One day, I happened to be home alone. I was sitting in the living room with the Bichon beside me. Everything was quiet. Then I suddenly had the overwhelming feeling that someone was watching me. I looked at my dog. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring straight toward the hallway. Her ears were raised, and she was growling quietly. I tried joking with her. "What are you looking at?" Instead of relaxing, her eyes slowly followed something invisible moving through the hallway. I couldn't see anything, but she continued tracking it with her eyes as though someone was walking past us. A cold feeling settled over me. Then, without warning, 2 doors slammed shut at exactly the same time. The hallway door and the guest bathroom door. The sound echoed through the house. My heart immediately started racing. I stood up, trying to convince myself there had to be a draft somewhere. Before I could even finish that thought, the closed window right beside me suddenly flew open with incredible force. It wasn't cracked open. It had been completely shut. Outside, everything was still. The trees weren't moving. There wasn't any noticeable wind. I didn't wait around trying to figure out what had happened. I grabbed the dogs, ran outside, and sat in the grass near the front of the house until someone else finally came home. After that day, I became even more uncomfortable living there. Several years later, my family went through a series of difficult events. My grandparents divorced after my grandfather decided to remarry. The separation affected everyone in the family. Then, in 2020, my grandmother was diagnosed with brain cancer. Watching her become ill was incredibly painful. Losing her was even harder. Around that time, family relationships became strained, and I found myself carrying a great deal of anger. Eventually, in 2022, we had to leave the house after my grandfather decided to sell it. Part of me actually felt relieved. Despite all the memories attached to that place, I was happy to leave it behind. After moving, one particular problem finally disappeared. For almost 2 years, I didn't experience sleep paralysis at all. I honestly believed it was finally over. Then, one day, it returned. I had fallen asleep on my back. Once again, I became aware that I couldn't move. This time, I saw what looked like a dark shadow running across the ceiling. It seemed to peer down through what looked like a hole above me. I forced myself awake and immediately moved to another bed in the house. I thought changing rooms would help. Instead, the experience seemed to continue. Again, I found myself trapped in another episode. The same shadow appeared. This time, it seemed even closer. I woke up again and moved to yet another room. The same thing happened. After several attempts to escape it by changing where I slept, I finally gave up completely and decided not to sleep for the rest of the night. Not long after that, during the week of my 18th birthday, I experienced another episode. This one felt different. During the paralysis, it seemed as though someone was choking me. I struggled to breathe until I finally woke up. Afterward, I turned on prayers and gospel music through my laptop because it helped me feel calmer. The following night, I had an unusually vivid dream. In the dream, dark figures with horns and glowing red eyes surrounded our house. Inside, my birthday cake was a traditional Yule log cake. As someone carried it toward me, it slipped and fell onto the floor. The dark figures outside began laughing. In the dream, I called several of my friends. Every one of them claimed they could see the same figures surrounding the house. Then I woke up. Whether those dreams and experiences had any deeper meaning or were simply the result of years of anxiety, recurring sleep paralysis, and vivid dreaming, I honestly can't say. Everyone interprets experiences like these differently. For me, they had a profound effect on my life. Over time, I became a Christian. I found that praying regularly and focusing on my faith gave me a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in years. Whether that change affected the experiences themselves or simply changed the way I responded to them, I don't know. I only know that I gradually began feeling less afraid. Those years remain some of the strangest and most emotionally exhausting of my life. Even now, I still remember many of those nights in remarkable detail. Some people believe experiences like mine have entirely psychological explanations. Others believe they're spiritual. I'm not here to convince anyone one way or the other. I'm simply sharing what happened to me as I experienced it. Those events shaped a significant part of my childhood and teenage years. Whether every experience has an ordinary explanation or not, they felt completely real at the time. Looking back now, I'm grateful that period of my life is behind me. Today, I sleep much more peacefully than I once did. And that's something I'll never take for granted. One of the strangest experiences I've ever had happened several years ago while I was visiting a friend who lived in a very rural part of my area. Even now, neither of us can fully explain what happened. I've tried to come up with logical explanations over the years, and maybe there is one. But both of us remember the night almost exactly the same way, which is why it has always stuck with me. My friend lived well outside the city, surrounded by farmland, forests, and long gravel roads. There weren't many neighbors nearby, and once the sun went down, the entire area became incredibly quiet. I had gone there to spend a couple of days with him. During the daytime, we kept ourselves busy working around his family's property. We fixed a few things, drove around on ATVs, and generally just enjoyed being outside. While we were working, we started talking about an abandoned sanitarium located not too far away. The place had been empty for years. Like most abandoned buildings, it had picked up plenty of local ghost stories over time. People claimed strange things happened there after dark, although we didn't really believe any of those stories. Mostly, we were just curious. We decided that once it got late enough, we'd go explore it ourselves. That evening, after finishing dinner, we watched a horror movie together. Looking back, that probably wasn't the smartest way to prepare ourselves for walking through abandoned buildings in the middle of the night. By the time the movie ended, it was close to midnight. We grabbed a couple of flashlights, got into the truck, and drove toward the old sanitarium. We didn't want anyone noticing us wandering around private property, so instead of parking right next to the buildings, we left the truck a fair distance away and walked the rest of the way through the darkness. The hike itself was quiet. The only sounds were insects, the wind moving through the trees, and our own footsteps. Eventually, the old buildings came into view. The sanitarium consisted of 3 large buildings standing fairly close together. Each one was about 3 stories tall. Even in the moonlight, they looked enormous. The brick walls were weathered from more than a century of exposure, and many of the windows had been broken long ago. The buildings had originally been constructed sometime in the late 1800s, and they definitely looked their age. We stood there for a minute just taking everything in. Seeing all 3 buildings together made the place feel even more impressive. After looking around for a way inside, we found a basement window that had already been broken. It was just large enough for us to climb through. One at a time, we carefully squeezed inside. The basement smelled exactly the way you'd expect an abandoned building to smell. Old concrete, dust, damp air. Everything echoed. We switched on our flashlights and started exploring. Most of the rooms were empty except for broken furniture, scattered debris, and pieces of old equipment that had been left behind years earlier. Every now and then, one of us would deliberately make a noise just to scare the other. We laughed far more than we were actually frightened. Despite all the stories we'd heard, nothing unusual happened. We didn't hear mysterious voices. We didn't see strange shadows. Nothing moved on its own. It was exactly what you'd expect from an abandoned building. Dark, quiet, creepy, but completely ordinary. As we wandered through the different floors, we found a few interesting old objects lying around. Nothing valuable, mostly small items that had somehow survived years of neglect. We spent quite a while looking through different rooms before finally deciding it was time to leave. Eventually, we climbed back out through the same basement window we'd entered. Once outside, we brushed ourselves off and started walking away. That's when something happened that neither of us expected. Almost at the same time, we both stopped walking. Something looked wrong. I looked back toward the sanitarium. For several seconds, I couldn't figure out what had changed. Then, it hit me. There were only 2 buildings. I stared at the property, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The 3rd building was gone. Not damaged. Not partially collapsed. Gone. In its place was what looked like a recently cleared area. The building appeared to have been completely demolished. Fresh debris covered the ground where it should have been standing. I immediately turned to my friend. Before I could say anything, he looked at me and asked the exact same question that had just entered my mind. Wasn't there another building? We both stood there silently, staring at the empty space. We clearly remembered seeing 3 buildings when we first arrived. In fact, we'd talked about them while walking toward the property. We both remembered standing there looking at all 3 before deciding which one to enter. Neither of us had any doubt about that. Yet now there were only 2. For several minutes we tried convincing ourselves that we'd somehow remembered incorrectly. Maybe we'd mistaken a line of trees for another building. Maybe the darkness had distorted our perspective. Maybe we'd only assumed there were 3 because of the way the property was laid out. The problem was that both of us remembered the same thing. 3 separate buildings, standing side by side. Before we entered, neither of us remembered hearing demolition equipment. There hadn't been any loud machinery, no trucks, no workers, nothing. And if the building had really been demolished recently, it seemed strange that we'd somehow failed to notice an entire missing structure while we were inside exploring. The whole situation left us completely confused. Eventually, we gave up trying to understand it and walked back to the truck. The drive home was much quieter than the drive there. Instead of joking around, we spent most of the ride trying to figure out what we'd experienced. Over the years, I've thought about that night many times. There are probably ordinary explanations. Memory isn't perfect. People influence each other's recollections without realizing it. Darkness changes depth perception. It's entirely possible that both of us simply misremembered what we originally saw. Those explanations make far more sense than anything mysterious. Still, I've always found it strange that we both noticed the missing building at exactly the same moment. Neither of us suggested it first. Neither of us planted the idea in the other's mind. We simply stopped walking, looked back, and realized the same thing. I've explored plenty of abandoned places since then. Some were much creepier than that old sanitarium. Some had far stranger stories attached to them. None of them have ever left me with the same feeling of confusion. Most ghost stories involve hearing unexplained sounds or seeing shadowy figures. Our experience was different. Nothing frightening happened while we were inside. In fact, the exploration itself was surprisingly uneventful. The strangest part didn't happen until we had already left. Whether we simply remembered the property incorrectly or experienced one of those rare moments where memory and reality seem impossible to reconcile, I honestly don't know. All I know is what both of us remember seeing. We arrived at an abandoned sanitarium with 3 large buildings standing under the moonlight. We spent the next hour exploring one of them. Then we walked outside, and somehow, there were only 2. To this day, neither of us has ever been able to explain why. When I was 18 years old, I was dating the man who would later become my husband. He was 24 at the time, and one evening he invited me over to his parents' house for dinner. It wasn't a holiday or a special occasion, but most of his adult brothers and sisters happened to be there as well, so the house was unusually busy. His family had a habit of gathering around bonfires after dinner. Officially, it was just a chance to spend time together outside. But everyone knew it was also an excuse for the adults to smoke cigarettes or marijuana away from the house. The property was in a rural area with very few neighbors. His parents' house sat on one piece of land, and about a quarter of a mile away, across an open field, stood his grandparents' home. From where we usually had the bonfire, you could clearly see both houses. His grandparents were some of the kindest people I'd ever met. They were deeply religious Pentecostal Christians and had a reputation throughout the community for helping anyone who needed it. They were the kind of people who never expected anything in return. If someone was struggling, they would quietly step in and help. People genuinely respected them. Long before I met the family, I'd heard a strange local story connected to their house. According to people in the area, a giant angel protected their property. Apparently, over the years, several people had claimed to see an enormous figure watching over the house without even knowing the story beforehand. I had no idea whether any of those stories were true. I'm generally skeptical about things like that. Still, there was something undeniably peaceful about being near their home. Whether it was simply because of the kind people who lived there or something else entirely, the place had a calm feeling that was difficult to describe. His parents' house felt completely different. Despite being extremely strict with their children, they weren't particularly religious. Over time, I also learned that family life there had been far from peaceful. Several of the children had experienced severe abuse while growing up. The atmosphere around that house always felt heavy compared to the warmth of the grandparents' home. That evening, after dinner, everyone started making their way toward the fire pit. It sat roughly halfway between the two houses. By then, it was already dark. A light drizzle had begun falling, but the rain wasn't heavy enough to stop anyone from going outside. The moon occasionally appeared behind the clouds, making the entire landscape glow with a pale silver light. It was actually a beautiful night despite the weather. As we walked toward the fire pit, my boyfriend suddenly realized he'd forgotten the lighter. He told me to wait where I was while he ran back to the house. I watched him walk away. Because of the moonlight, I could easily see his silhouette moving across the yard. I watched him reach the porch. I heard the screen door open. Then I heard it swing shut behind him. Everything seemed completely normal. I stood there alone for a few seconds, listening to the rain falling softly around me. Then I heard the screen door again. This time it opened with a loud creak before slamming shut much harder than before. I looked toward the house. A figure was already moving in my direction. At first, I assumed it was my boyfriend returning with the lighter. I could hear footsteps coming toward me. Whoever it was started out running. Then, as they got closer, they slowed down. For a moment, I didn't think anything was unusual. Then I noticed something. The figure looked smaller than my boyfriend. Quite a bit smaller. I frowned, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. As the figure approached, it passed behind a large tree. Then it stopped. Completely, I couldn't see it anymore because the trunk blocked my view. Assuming my boyfriend was simply trying to scare me, I laughed nervously. Very funny, I called out. "I know you're there." There was no answer. I waited another second. Still nothing. I called his name. "Mike?" Silence. Then I heard something. Very faint. The sound of feet shifting against the dirt. Someone or something was definitely standing behind that tree. I could hear the movement clearly, but whoever it was refused to answer me. At that point, I started becoming genuinely frightened. I considered walking back toward the house. Before I could move, I heard something that made the entire situation even stranger. The screen door at the house opened again, Then it closed. This time, it sounded completely normal. A second later, I heard it again. Another opening. Another closing. I immediately looked toward the house. That didn't make any sense. If the figure standing behind the tree had come from the house, how was I suddenly hearing the screen door again? My mind couldn't put the pieces together. Then everything happened at once. The figure suddenly burst out from behind the tree. It wasn't walking, it was running. It crossed into the moonlight about 15 feet away from me. For one brief moment, I saw it clearly enough to know it wasn't my boyfriend. Then, instead of running toward either house, it turned sharply and sprinted straight up the mountainside. The speed was unbelievable. I could hear every footstep, every dry leaf crunching beneath it, every twig snapping as it climbed. The sound echoed through the quiet night until it finally disappeared into the darkness above. I stood completely frozen. I don't remember breathing. I don't remember thinking. I simply stared toward the hillside where it had vanished. Several moments later, I saw two people walking toward me. It was my boyfriend and his brother. The moment they got close, they immediately realized something was wrong. I must have looked terrified because they both stopped and asked what had happened. It took me a moment before I could even speak. Eventually, I explained everything. I told them about hearing the screen door slam, the smaller figure, the footsteps, the silence behind the tree, and finally, whatever had run up the mountain. I expected them to laugh. I expected them to tell me I'd imagined it. Instead, they exchanged a quick look. Neither of them seemed surprised. That reaction unsettled me almost as much as the experience itself. My boyfriend explained something that immediately caught my attention. Both he and his brother had heard the screen door slam while they were inside the house. Each of them had assumed the other had already gone outside. Neither thought much about it because they left only seconds apart. But according to them, nobody had actually gone outside when they heard that first loud slam. That meant the figure I'd watched approaching me couldn't have been either one of them. Then they reminded me of the family story I'd heard before. They believed the angel that supposedly watched over the grandparents' property also protected the area around it. According to them, whatever I'd encountered refused to move toward the grandparents' house because it couldn't. Instead, it turned and fled up the mountain. They genuinely believed the angel had been protecting me. Whether that's what actually happened, I honestly don't know. There are certainly more ordinary explanations. Perhaps someone else had been walking through the property. Maybe the darkness distorted the figure's appearance. Maybe fear caused me to misjudge what I saw. I understand all of those possibilities. But even after almost 20 years, one part of the experience has never left me. Whenever I think back to that night, I still feel the exact same tightness in my chest that I felt standing there alone in the drizzle. I can still hear the screen door slamming shut. I can still remember calling out into the darkness and hearing nothing except quiet footsteps shifting behind the tree. And I can still picture that figure bursting into the open before disappearing up the mountain faster than I thought anyone could run. Whether it was an unusual coincidence, a misunderstanding, or something I'll never be able to explain, I honestly don't know. All I know is that it's one night I've never forgotten. And after all these years, it still feels just as unsettling to remember as it did to experience. A few years ago, I was temporarily assigned to work security at a movie theater in Binondo, Manila, the oldest Chinatown in the world. The area is filled with history, and like many historic places, it's also surrounded by countless ghost stories. Before I started working there, I didn't pay much attention to those stories. Every old building seems to have local legends, and I assumed this place was no different. The cinema was located inside a shopping mall, and my job involved helping with security operations. Most days were completely normal, but there was one part of the building that everyone seemed to avoid talking about for too long. Cinema 4. Almost every employee who had worked there for years had a story about it. The older security guards especially had plenty of experiences to share. Those assigned to the graveyard shift often talked about hearing strange noises while making their nightly patrols. Some claimed they heard footsteps inside empty theaters. Others said they occasionally felt as though someone was sitting inside the screening room long after the last movie had ended. Whether those stories were true or not, I couldn't say. But one thing happened every single day, and everyone on staff witnessed it. Before the theater opened each morning, a K-9 security unit inspected the building as part of the mall's standard security procedures. The dogs would search every theater before customers were allowed inside. The routine never changed. The handlers would lead the dog from one cinema to the next until every room had been checked. Every room except one. Whenever they reached Cinema 4, the dogs refused to enter. Not hesitated. Refused. The handlers would encourage them to walk through the doorway, but the dogs would stop at the entrance. Some planted all four paws firmly on the ground. Others simply backed away. No amount of encouragement seemed to make any difference. At first, I assumed it was just one unusually stubborn dog. Then another dog was assigned. It behaved exactly the same way. Eventually, I watched several different K-9 dogs over the course of my assignment. Every single one reacted the same way. They willingly entered every other cinema in the building. Only Cinema 4 caused them to stop. The handlers themselves didn't seem surprised anymore. It had apparently been happening for a long time. Some of the older employees laughed about it. Others became noticeably quiet whenever the subject came up. One longtime staff member finally explained the local story to me. According to employees who had worked there for years, people believed a family of ghosts lived inside Cinema 4. I didn't know whether to believe that. Personally, I figured there was probably an ordinary explanation for the dog's behavior. Animals sometimes react to smells or sounds that humans can't detect. Maybe there was something unique about that particular room. Still, watching multiple trained dogs refuse to cross the same doorway every single day was undeniably strange. Even after seeing that, I still didn't believe anything paranormal had happened. Then, another incident occurred that became one of the most talked about stories among the staff. It happened during the release of a blockbuster movie. The theater was completely packed. Almost every seat in every screening had sold out. One showing inside Cinema 4 had only 3 seats left. All of them were in the very front row, directly beneath the screen. Most people don't like sitting that close because you have to look almost straight up during the movie. Even so, 3 customers decided to buy those remaining seats rather than miss the film. The movie had already started when something unexpected happened. The power suddenly went out. Not just inside the cinema. The entire mall lost electricity. Normally, the emergency generators started almost immediately. That night, however, there was an unusual delay. For roughly 5 minutes, the theater remained almost completely dark. The movie stopped. The screen went black. The audience sat quietly, waiting for the power to return. During those few minutes, one of the 3 customers sitting in the front row decided to take a selfie. According to her later, she simply wanted something to do while everyone waited in the darkness. She held up her phone, turned on the camera, and took the picture. When the mall's electricity finally returned, the movie resumed, and everyone continued watching as though nothing unusual had happened. It wasn't until later that the 3 customers looked through the photograph. That's when they noticed something strange. The front row had only the three of them sitting there. They all knew that because they had specifically commented earlier about being the only people willing to sit so close to the screen. Yet in the photograph, another child appeared. Sitting in one of the empty seats beside them was what looked like a young Chinese boy. None of the three remembered anyone sitting there. No one had noticed another child during the blackout. According to the customers, the seat had been empty. The woman who had taken the selfie eventually showed the picture to several staff members. I wasn't the first person to see it, but by the time I heard about it, multiple employees had already talked about what they had seen. The image quickly became the biggest topic of conversation in the theater. Some employees believed it confirmed every ghost story they'd ever heard about Cinema 4. Others argued that it had to be some kind of camera glitch, an editing error, or someone accidentally walking into frame during the long exposure. The woman herself didn't seem interested in finding out. After showing the photograph to a few people, she immediately deleted it. She didn't keep a copy. She didn't post it online. She simply erased it. That meant there was no way to examine it more carefully afterward. Without the original image, nobody could investigate what had actually appeared in the photograph. As a result, the story quickly became another piece of local theater folklore. To this day, I honestly don't know what happened. There are many possible explanations. Digital cameras can produce strange artifacts, especially in low light. People sometimes appear unexpectedly in photographs without being noticed in the moment. Memory can also be unreliable, especially during stressful or confusing situations like a sudden blackout. All of those explanations are entirely possible. Even so, it's difficult to ignore how many unusual stories surrounded that particular cinema long before the photograph was ever taken. The canine dogs refusing to enter. The stories shared by longtime night shift guards. The reputation Cinema 4 had built over many years. Maybe all of it was nothing more than coincidence mixed with local legends. Or maybe old stories have a way of growing stronger every time something unusual happens. I honestly can't say. What I do know is that during my time working there, Cinema 4 had a reputation unlike any other theater in the building. Whether you believed the stories or not, everyone knew its name. And every morning, without fail, the canine dogs would walk confidently through every cinema in the complex until they reached Cinema 4. Then, every single one of them would stop at the doorway and refuse to take another step. One experience from my teenage years has stayed with me for a very long time. Even now, I don't really know what to make of it. I've spent years trying to explain it in a logical way, and honestly, that's still the explanation I lean toward. I don't consider myself someone who believes in the paranormal. In fact, I'm pretty skeptical of stories involving ghosts or monsters. That being said, there's one moment I still can't completely explain. I was around 14 years old at the time. One afternoon, I was riding in the car with my dad and his girlfriend. It was just a normal drive. I don't remember where we were going because nothing about the day stood out until that moment. I was sitting quietly looking out the side window while they talked in the front seats. The scenery passed by like it always did. Trees, fields, road signs. Nothing unusual. Then, out of nowhere, I noticed movement. Something was running toward the car. At first, my brain couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It looked vaguely human, but only vaguely. The figure appeared completely naked, with long arms and legs moving unnaturally fast as it sprinted directly toward us. Its body looked human enough that my mind immediately recognized the shape. Its face, however, was different. That's the part I still remember most clearly. I couldn't make out any features. It wasn't because it was too far away. It almost looked blurred, as if someone had deliberately erased the details of its face. Not smooth, Not blank, just impossible to focus on. For a split second, I honestly thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Then I kept watching. The thing continued running. It wasn't standing still. It wasn't disappearing. It stayed in view long enough for me to keep following it with my eyes. I remember thinking, I'm still looking at it. That realization actually frightened me more than seeing it in the first place. Usually, if you mistake a shadow or a tree for something else, the illusion disappears almost immediately once you look more carefully. This didn't. It remained there. Running, I remember having a very clear thought. Holy, this is actually real. Not that I believed it was some supernatural creature, just that whatever I was looking at genuinely existed in front of me. It kept pace with the car for a short time before falling behind us. I turned as much as I could in my seat to keep watching through the rear window. It continued running after us. Eventually, the distance became too great, and I lost sight of it. That was it. The entire encounter probably lasted only several seconds, maybe a little longer, long enough that I clearly remember following its movement the entire time. As soon as it disappeared, I looked at my dad and his girlfriend. Neither of them had reacted. Neither of them had looked toward the side of the road. Neither of them had seen anything. I didn't even know what to say. How do you explain something like that without sounding completely ridiculous? Eventually, I mentioned what I'd seen. Both of them looked confused. Neither had noticed anything unusual. That honestly made the experience even stranger. If both of them had seen the same thing, at least we'd know there had definitely been something there. Instead, I was the only one who saw it. Over the years, I've thought about that moment countless times. I've tried explaining it in every ordinary way I can think of. Maybe it was an oddly shaped person running. Maybe the lighting distorted my view. Maybe my brain briefly misinterpreted something I'd only seen for a moment. Those explanations all seem far more likely than anything supernatural. Even so, I still remember how unusually long I watched it. It wasn't just a quick glimpse. I had enough time to observe it while the car kept moving. That memory has stayed with me ever since. It's also not the only strange thing I've experienced. Nothing quite as dramatic, but a few other moments have definitely made me stop and question what I thought I'd heard or seen. For example, I've occasionally heard what sounded like footsteps directly behind me, not vague sounds somewhere nearby. Clear footsteps. The kind that make you instinctively turn around because you're certain someone is walking toward you. Every time, I'd turn around, and nobody would be there. Once, I was looking toward a window and noticed what appeared to be someone's reflection. For a brief moment, it looked like another person was standing behind me. I turned immediately. The room was empty. When I looked back at the glass, the reflection was gone. Another time, I watched a light drifting slowly across the night sky. At first, I assumed it was a satellite or maybe a distant aircraft. Then, without warning, it suddenly shot off at incredible speed until it disappeared from view. Again, there are probably perfectly ordinary explanations. Perspective can be deceptive. Aircraft can appear to move strangely depending on their direction. Atmospheric conditions can create unusual visual effects. I know all of that. In fact, I generally prefer those explanations. The truth is, I don't actually believe in the paranormal. If anything, I'm naturally skeptical. I also know that I probably make myself more susceptible to creepy ideas than most people. I consume a huge amount of horror content. I love scary movies. I spend time reading ghost stories. I'm also a horror artist, so my imagination is constantly filled with disturbing creatures, strange environments, and unsettling imagery. creating monsters is literally part of what I enjoy doing. Because of that, I'm always careful not to jump to supernatural conclusions. I know how powerful the human imagination can be. Our brains naturally search for patterns. Sometimes they connect unrelated details. Sometimes they briefly convince us we've seen something extraordinary when there's actually a perfectly normal explanation. That awareness is exactly why I've never claimed any of these experiences were paranormal. I'm not trying to convince anyone that mysterious creatures exist. I'm simply describing moments that genuinely happen from my perspective. Maybe every single one has an ordinary explanation. Honestly, I hope they do. Even so, I still remember the feeling of seeing that strange figure running alongside our car. I still remember hearing footsteps behind me that suddenly stopped. I still remember the reflection that disappeared the moment I turned around. And I still remember watching that distant light suddenly race across the sky. Whether those experiences were unusual coincidences, tricks of perception, or simply the result of an overactive imagination shaped by years of loving horror, I'll probably never know. All I know is that they felt completely real while they were happening. And even after all these years, they're still strange enough that I occasionally find myself thinking about them and wondering what I actually saw. One of the strangest periods of my life happened years ago at a friend's house. Even now, I don't know what to think about it. I'm not someone who automatically assumes every unexplained event is paranormal. In fact, I usually look for ordinary explanations first. Old houses make noise. People influence each other's expectations. Memory isn't perfect. I understand all of that. Still, there was about a year when a group of us experienced enough strange things in that house that we eventually stopped trying to explain every single one. It all took place at one of my friend's homes. A bunch of us spent a lot of time there after school and on weekends. There were usually around 5 of us hanging out together, playing games, watching movies, or just talking for hours. The house itself wasn't especially old or obviously creepy. At least, not at first. Then little things started happening. The first thing we all noticed was footsteps. Every now and then, we'd hear what sounded like someone walking down the hallway. Not loud running, just slow, ordinary footsteps. Whenever it happened, we'd stop whatever we were doing and listen. Sometimes we'd all look at each other at exactly the same time, because we'd clearly heard it. Then, we'd walk into the hallway to see who was there. Nobody. Eventually, we started joking that the house was haunted. Looking back now, those sounds could easily have been the house settling. Wood expands and contracts. Floors creak. Temperature changes can create noises that sound surprisingly similar to footsteps. That explanation makes perfect sense. Still, hearing them over and over again made us unusually alert. After a while, every strange sound caught our attention. One day, something happened directly in front of me. We had been cleaning up before heading outside. There was a blanket lying nearby, and I reached toward it because I was about to fold it up and put it away. Just before I grabbed it, the blanket suddenly moved. Not a little. It was pulled away from me. It wasn't blown by the wind. It didn't slowly slide. It felt as though someone had grabbed the other end and quickly tugged it away from my hand. I froze immediately. There was nobody standing there. For several seconds, I simply stared at the blanket. Even today, I still don't know how to explain that one. Maybe I accidentally caught it with my foot. Maybe the fabric slipped in a strange way. Maybe static electricity somehow played a role. I honestly have no idea. I only know that it frightened me badly enough that I still remember the feeling years later. Another experience happened when I was completely alone. The others had stepped outside for a few minutes, leaving me inside the house. I don't remember exactly what I was doing, but I know I was the only person indoors. Suddenly, I heard loud banging coming from the basement hatch. Not one knock. Several heavy bangs. It sounded like something underneath the hatch was trying to get out. The sound echoed through the house. I didn't stop to investigate. I ran. I practically sprinted out the front door. By the time my friends came back, I was standing outside waiting for them. They immediately asked why I was outside instead of inside. When I explained what I'd heard, most of them looked skeptical. A couple of them laughed. They thought I was exaggerating. Still, we all went back inside together. They opened the basement hatch. There was nothing there. No animals, no fallen objects. Nothing that obviously could have made the noise. To this day, even some of my friends still don't believe that happened. They think I probably misheard something. Maybe they're right. I honestly can't prove otherwise. One of the strangest things we all witnessed involved cups sitting on the kitchen counter. We were standing nearby talking when one of the cups slowly slid across the countertop. It wasn't thrown. It didn't suddenly tip over. It simply moved across the surface. At first, we thought someone must have bumped the counter. Nobody had. Then another cup shifted slightly. We all stood there staring. Eventually, someone checked whether the counter was uneven. Another person suggested there might have been water underneath the cups, causing them to slide. Honestly, that's probably the most reasonable explanation. Smooth surfaces, moisture, and vibrations can sometimes make objects move in unexpected ways. Even so, watching it happen without immediately understanding why definitely got everyone's attention. As more strange things happened over the months, we developed a habit. Every unusual noise immediately triggered the same reaction. Someone would say, "Did you hear that?" The rest of us would stop talking. Then all 5 of us would investigate together. It almost became a routine. A creak, a thump, something falling. We'd all go looking for the source. Sometimes we'd find one. Other times, we wouldn't. Looking back, I sometimes wonder whether we unintentionally made each other more sensitive to every tiny sound inside the house. Once you're expecting something unusual, your brain starts paying much closer attention to things you'd normally ignore. Psychology can be incredibly powerful. That seems like a very real possibility. At the same time, some of those moments still feel difficult to explain completely. Whatever was happening, it didn't last forever. After about a year, the strange experiences gradually stopped. The footsteps became less frequent. The unexplained noises disappeared. Nothing unusual seemed to happen anymore. Then, about a year after everything settled down, my friend's family moved away. I've often wondered whether the two things were completely unrelated. Most likely they were. Since then, I've visited plenty of other houses. I've spent nights in old buildings. I've stayed in places that people claimed were haunted. Nothing remotely similar has ever happened again. Not once. Sometimes, I think we were simply teenagers with active imaginations who unintentionally fed off one another's expectations. That's honestly the explanation I prefer. It makes sense. Groups can influence each other without realizing it. Small events become bigger stories over time. Normal sounds begin feeling unusual. Other times, I remember standing there with 4 other people, all hearing the same noise at exactly the same moment. I remember the blanket slipping away from my hand. I remember running out of the house after hearing the basement hatch banging beneath my feet. I remember watching cups slide across the counter. Whether every one of those experiences had an ordinary explanation or not, I honestly can't say. Maybe they did. Maybe we simply never discovered them. What I do know is that for roughly a year, all 5 of us experienced enough strange moments that we constantly found ourselves looking at each other and asking the same question. Did you hear that too? Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. I've never experienced anything quite like it again. Sometimes I still wonder whether the house was unusual, or whether, for one strange year, 5 teenagers simply convinced themselves that ordinary events were far stranger than they really were. I don't know which explanation is correct, but after all this time, I'm still not completely sure either one answers every question. During the last couple of years of high school, I experienced sleep paralysis pretty regularly. It happened often enough that I eventually recognized the feeling almost immediately. I'd wake up mentally, but my body would still be asleep. At first, it was terrifying. I'd open my eyes and realize I couldn't move. No matter how hard I tried, my arms wouldn't respond. My legs wouldn't move. Sometimes I couldn't even speak. Those episodes usually came with strange hallucinations. I'd see things that weren't really there, or hear sounds that disappeared the moment I fully woke up. Eventually, I learned what sleep paralysis was, which made it a little less frightening. Even then, every episode felt incredibly real while it was happening. One experience, though, was unlike any of the others. It wasn't necessarily the scariest one, but it was definitely the strangest. Around that time, I had been watching a lot of Minecraft Let's Play videos online. I spent hours watching different creators build worlds, explore caves, and complete adventures. It was basically all I watched after school. One afternoon, I fell asleep on the couch in my family's living room. I hadn't planned on taking a nap. I was just tired and drifted off. Almost immediately, I started dreaming. The dream itself felt completely normal at first. I was inside a Minecraft world. Everything looked exactly the way you'd expect. The blocky landscape, the square trees, the pixelated animals. I seemed to be on some kind of quest, although I don't remember exactly what I was supposed to be doing. Then I noticed someone standing nearby. At first glance, he looked completely out of place. Not because he was dangerous, not because he was acting strangely, simply because he wasn't made of blocks like everything else. He looked like an ordinary person, a completely normal human being standing inside a Minecraft world. For some reason, I instantly knew he wasn't supposed to be there. It wasn't just his appearance, it was a feeling. The dream itself seemed to recognize that he didn't belong. He calmly looked at me and said something unexpected. "You know you don't have to do all of this." I remember staring at him, confused. Then he explained. He told me I had control over the dream. According to him, I could simply skip everything and fast forward to the end. For some reason, that idea made perfect sense. So I did exactly that. Instantly, the entire adventure disappeared. The next thing I knew, I was standing in front of what appeared to be a king. The king was giving some kind of speech. I don't remember what he was talking about. People surrounded him as though some major event had just reached its conclusion. The strange man was still standing beside me. Then he spoke again. "You can go deeper." I didn't know what he meant. Before I could ask, it somehow became obvious. I moved directly into the king's mind. Suddenly, I wasn't just looking at him anymore. I was experiencing everything that made him who he was. His memories, his childhood, his fears, his hopes, his dreams, his happiest moments, his regrets. It was as though his entire life had been unfolded in front of me all at once. I wasn't watching it like a movie. I was inside it. Then, something even stranger happened. The king himself started dreaming. Without really understanding how, I somehow entered his dream as well. At that point, the whole experience became increasingly surreal. It felt like I was dreaming inside another dream. Layers kept unfolding one after another. The mysterious man never left my side. He continued encouraging me. Go further. Again, I obeyed. That's when everything changed. Normally, when I experienced sleep paralysis, there was a very specific pattern. I'd become aware that I was waking up. The dream would fade into darkness. Everything would go quiet. Then I'd find myself lying in bed or on the couch, unable to move while trying desperately to wake the rest of my body. That wasn't what happened this time. Instead, reality began flickering. One moment, I was standing inside the dream. The next moment, I was lying on my family's couch. Then, I was back inside the dream. Then, back in the living room. Again and again. It happened rapidly, almost like someone was switching television channels back and forth. Neither reality nor the dream seemed stable anymore. I could see my living room for a split second. Then I was back inside the king's dream. Then I saw the couch again. Then the Minecraft world returned. The transitions became faster and faster. During all of this, the mysterious man completely changed. For the first time, he looked frightened. Instead of calmly telling me to continue, he began yelling. No, stop. His voice echoed around me as everything continued flashing between the dream and reality. I didn't understand what he wanted me to stop doing. I wasn't even sure what I was doing anymore. The constant switching became overwhelming. I couldn't tell which version was real. The dream. The living room. The dream again. Everything blurred together. Then, suddenly, I woke up. Completely, I sat upright on the couch with a huge gasp, trying to catch my breath. My heart was racing. For several moments, I simply looked around the room, making sure I was actually awake. Everything was normal. The television was off. The room was quiet. Nothing strange remained. As the adrenaline slowly faded, I realized it had all been a dream, or more accurately, a dream mixed with sleep paralysis. I've experienced plenty of vivid dreams over the years. I've experienced sleep paralysis several times too. But I've never experienced anything quite like that. It wasn't the content of the dream that stayed with me. Dreams are naturally weird. What stood out was the strange transition between dreaming and waking. Instead of the usual darkness and silence, it felt as though my brain couldn't decide whether I was still asleep or already awake. It kept rapidly switching between both states. I've since read that the boundary between dreaming and waking can sometimes become blurred during sleep paralysis. People occasionally report false awakenings, dreams within dreams, and vivid hallucinations that overlap with their real surroundings. That explanation honestly makes the most sense to me. Our brains are capable of producing incredibly convincing experiences while we're caught somewhere between sleep and consciousness. Even knowing that, though, this particular experience has always felt different from every other episode I've had. Maybe it was because of the unusually detailed dream. Maybe it was the strange man who seemed aware that he didn't belong there. Or maybe it was simply the bizarre flickering between two completely different realities before I finally woke up. I don't think there was anything supernatural about it. I think it was simply my brain doing something incredibly unusual while I was caught between dreaming and waking. Even so, after all these years, it's still the one dream I remember more clearly than almost any other. Not because I believe it meant anything, but because, for a few unforgettable moments, it felt unlike anything I'd ever experienced before, or since. When I was very young, I experienced things that I still think about from time to time. Even now, I don't know exactly what happened. I've never been able to prove that anything supernatural was involved, and I know there are many ordinary explanations for strange childhood memories, vivid dreams, and the way our brains work when we're young. Still, some of those memories have stayed with me so clearly that I can remember them decades later. The earliest thing I remember happened almost every night. I had the smallest bedroom in the house. It was what most people would call a box room. It was so small that my bed fit almost perfectly between two walls. The head of the bed touched one wall, and the foot of the bed was only inches from the opposite one. There wasn't much space to move around. Every night, after climbing into bed, I would lie there waiting to fall asleep. That's when I would see it. A dark shadow would appear behind me and move across the room. It wasn't shaped like a person. It was more like a large black shape that glided silently through the air. It would pass over my bed near the ceiling, then drift down the wall at the foot of the bed before disappearing. It happened often enough that I almost expected it every night. As a child, I had no explanation for it. Eventually, I became so frightened that I stopped sleeping in my bedroom. Instead, I started sleeping downstairs whenever I could. For a little while, I thought that it solved the problem. Then I began seeing the same shadow downstairs. Our living room had a fireplace, and more than once I remember seeing the shadow appear from that direction before disappearing again. At that point, I honestly believed there was nowhere in the house where I felt completely comfortable. The strangest experience happened one night when I was still very young. Even now, it's the most vivid nightmare I've ever had. Most dreams disappear within minutes of waking up. This one never did. I can still remember parts of it with surprising clarity. In the dream, I was lying in my own bed. Everything looked normal at first. Then I realized something was terribly wrong. The bed was still there. The floor beneath it was still there. But the walls of my bedroom had disappeared. Instead, it felt as though my bed was sitting in the middle of an enormous pit. All around me was fire, not small flames. Huge walls of fire stretching upward into darkness. I could feel the heat. That has always been the part that disturbed me most. It didn't simply look hot. It felt hot. The warmth seemed to rise through the bed itself, as though flames surrounded me on every side. Along the walls of the pit were narrow stone ledges. Standing, or rather hanging, from those ledges were people. Their legs appeared to be chained or restrained. Each of them held what looked like a pickaxe. They weren't working. They were screaming. Some cried for help. Others simply screamed in pain. The sound echoed endlessly around me. I remember lying completely still in my bed, terrified. For some reason, I convinced myself that pretending to be asleep would somehow protect me. Every few moments, I'd slowly open my eyes. Every time I looked, I was still there. Nothing had changed. The fire remained. The screaming continued. Eventually, I pulled the blanket over my head. I stayed underneath the covers until, somehow, I eventually fell asleep again. The next morning, I woke up in my bedroom as though nothing had happened. I've always assumed it was simply an unusually vivid nightmare. That's by far the most likely explanation. But because it felt so incredibly real, the memory has stayed with me ever since. As I grew older, the shadow sightings became much less frequent. Instead of appearing every night, I'd only occasionally catch something dark moving out of the corner of my eye. Whenever I turned to look directly at it, there was nothing there. Those moments happened only rarely, and eventually, they almost disappeared altogether. For years, I assumed all of those experiences existed only in my imagination. My mother certainly didn't believe my stories. Whenever I tried telling her about the shadows, she always dismissed them as childhood imagination. Then one day she told me something I'd never heard before. Apparently, strange things had happened in that room long before I was old enough to remember them. She said that when I was still a baby, she'd occasionally hear loud bangs coming from my bedroom. Whenever she went to investigate, she sometimes found pictures hanging on the wall turned around for no obvious reason. She also remembered finding toys or other small objects moved to different places while I was still too young to move them myself. She never claimed anything paranormal had happened. She simply admitted she never found explanations for those incidents. One story she told me has always stood out. When I was still a baby, we went on vacation. She had a camera with her and clearly remembered placing it inside my stroller before we left. At some point during the trip, it disappeared. The family searched everywhere. Nobody could find it. Eventually, everyone assumed it had been lost. Several months later, the camera suddenly turned up inside my bedroom. It was sitting on the bedside table. No one knew how it got there. The strange part came when they looked at the photographs. According to my mother, every picture that contained me had turned completely black. The images were still there. But wherever I appeared, the photograph showed only darkness. To this day, she says she has no explanation for it. Years later, another family member added something else to the story. When my older brother eventually moved back home, I had already taken over his bedroom. That meant he ended up sleeping in my old room. After a while, he started mentioning strange experiences of his own. One night he became convinced someone was pulling the blankets off him while he was trying to sleep. Several times he stormed out onto the landing, convinced that one of us was playing tricks on him. Nobody had been anywhere near his room. Another night, he heard repeated knocking coming through the wall we shared. Eventually, he became annoyed enough to come into my room and tell me to stop making noise because he had work the next morning. The only problem was that I wasn't anywhere near that wall. I was sitting on the opposite side of my bedroom when he walked in. Neither of us could explain what he'd heard. Later, my mother's fiancé also ended up sleeping in that room after arguments occasionally led him to spend the night there instead of with my mom. He eventually mentioned having unusually disturbing nightmares whenever he slept there. He also claimed to have seen dark shadows inside the room on more than one occasion. Despite all of those stories, my mother has never believed there was anything unusual about the room itself. She still thinks every incident probably has an ordinary explanation. Maybe she's right. Old houses make strange noises. Sleep paralysis, vivid dreams, and hypnagogic hallucinations are all well-documented experiences. Memory also changes over time, especially memories from early childhood. Those explanations make much more sense than assuming anything supernatural. Even so, something about that room has always felt different to me. Nobody sleeps there anymore. Every now and then, I still walk inside. From the outside, it looks like the most ordinary bedroom in the house. It's right in the middle of the landing. There's nothing unusual about its location. Nothing about the furniture stands out. Nothing appears out of place. Yet every time I step inside, I get exactly the same feeling I had as a child. The air somehow feels heavier, almost thicker. It's difficult to explain without sounding dramatic. It simply feels as though someone is quietly watching you. I've never been able to prove that feeling means anything. Maybe it's nothing more than the memories attached to that room. Maybe my childhood experiences permanently changed the way I feel whenever I walk through that doorway. That's probably the most reasonable explanation. But even now, after all these years, I still don't stay in that room any longer than I have to. Whether the room was ever truly unusual, or whether my mind simply connected years of unrelated experiences to one place, I'll probably never know. All I know is that out of every room in every house I've ever lived in, that's the only one that has never completely felt ordinary to me. One experience has stayed with me for years, even though I'm fairly sure there must be a logical explanation for it. Looking back now, I actually think I know what probably happened. I was dangerously exhausted, and I was almost certainly experiencing the effects of falling asleep behind the wheel. Even so, the timing of everything that followed has always made the memory difficult to forget. At the time, I had just finished a long shift at work. I'd only slept a few hours the night before, and I'd just completed a 10-hour workday. Despite being exhausted, I decided to drive to my girlfriend's house. She lived about an hour and a half away, and at the time I figured I could push through the tiredness. That was a terrible decision. Today, I'd never do it again. The first part of the drive wasn't too bad. I rolled the windows down for fresh air, turned the radio up, and tried everything I could think of to stay alert. For a while, it seemed to be working. About a third of the way into the trip, though, the exhaustion started catching up with me. My eyelids became heavier. I found myself blinking more often. A couple of times, I realized I couldn't remember the last few seconds of the drive, which should have been a huge warning sign. I knew I was losing the battle against sleep. The road I was traveling followed the edge of an old military depot. The area had been around for decades and included several old buildings, walking trails, and a few crosswalks connecting different sections of the property. It wasn't especially busy that evening. There weren't many other cars around. As I approached one particular stretch near the old barracks, I felt myself drifting again. I was still trying to keep my eyes open when something suddenly appeared in front of me. A white figure stepped into the road. It happened so fast that I barely had time to react. Instinct took over. I slammed on the brakes as hard as I could. The tires screeched. But I already knew it was too late. The car struck the figure. I remember seeing it hit the front of the vehicle. Then, in what felt like slow motion, I watched it come through the windshield. It seemed to pass directly into me. For one terrifying instant, I was convinced I'd just hit someone. My heart exploded into a full panic. Adrenaline flooded through my body. I could barely breathe. The car came to a stop. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, trying to understand what had just happened. Then I looked around. There was nobody there. No person lying on the road. No damaged windshield. No blood. No dent in the front of the car. Nothing. The road was completely empty. I got out of the vehicle and looked around anyway. There was absolutely no sign that I'd hit anything. That confusion slowly replaced the panic. The more I thought about it, the more one explanation made sense. I'd almost fallen asleep. The white figure had probably been part of a dream that blended into reality for a few terrifying seconds. I've since learned that people experiencing extreme fatigue can have brief dreamlike hallucinations while still technically awake. Those are sometimes called microsleeps, and they can be incredibly dangerous. Looking back now, that's almost certainly what happened. After sitting there for several minutes and calming down, I got back into the car. Oddly enough, I wasn't tired anymore. The adrenaline had completely erased every trace of sleepiness. I stayed fully awake for the rest of the drive. That experience alone would have been enough to remember forever. But later that night, something happened that made the whole situation even stranger. After arriving safely, I couldn't stop thinking about where the incident had happened. Out of curiosity, I started searching online for information about the old military depot. I wasn't looking for ghost stories. I was simply interested in learning more about the history of the place. Eventually, I found several articles describing the depot's past. It had originally been used for military training many decades earlier. Beginning in the early 20th century, thousands of soldiers had trained there before the facility eventually changed purposes over the years. As I continued reading, I came across a section discussing accidents that had occurred on the property. One particular entry immediately caught my attention. According to the information I found, sometime during the 1980s, an employee working at the depot had been struck and killed while crossing the road. The accident happened on the very same stretch of road where I'd experienced my terrifying encounter. I stared at the screen for several minutes. The timing and location were impossible to ignore. I immediately started searching for more information. I wanted to know exactly where the accident happened, what time of day it occurred, whether there were photographs or newspaper articles describing it. Unfortunately, I couldn't find much. Most of the available information was brief. It simply stated that a worker had been fatally struck while crossing the road. There weren't many additional details. At that point, my imagination naturally started connecting the two events. Had I somehow seen something connected to that old accident? Or had my exhausted brain simply created a hallucination that happened to match a real historical event by pure coincidence? Personally, I think the second explanation is much more likely. I was dangerously sleep-deprived. I was already experiencing microsleeps behind the wheel. Everything about my condition pointed toward a fatigue-induced hallucination. The coincidence only became meaningful afterward because I learned about the accident later that evening. Human memory is very good at connecting unrelated events once we discover surprising information. That's probably exactly what happened. Even so, I can't deny how strange the timing felt. If I'd never looked up the history of that road, I probably would have dismissed the entire experience as nothing more than an exhaustion-induced dream. Instead, finding that article permanently linked the two memories together in my mind. I've told the story to a handful of people over the years. Most of them smile politely. A few clearly think I'm making it up. Honestly, I don't blame them. If someone else told me the exact same story, I'd probably assume exhaustion had caused the entire experience too. In fact, that's still what I believe happened. The lesson I took away from that day wasn't that I encountered anything paranormal. It was that driving while severely sleep-deprived is incredibly dangerous. For a few terrifying seconds, my brain convinced me I'd hit another human being. If there really had been someone crossing that road, the outcome could have been far worse. Thankfully, no one was there. I was lucky. Very lucky. Whatever I actually saw that evening, it completely changed the way I think about driving when I'm tired. Now, if I ever feel myself getting that exhausted behind the wheel, I pull over. No destination is worth risking your life or someone else's. As for that white figure, I'll probably never know exactly what my mind created during those few frightening seconds. Whether it was simply a vivid hallucination brought on by exhaustion or an extraordinary coincidence connected to the history of that old road, I honestly can't say. All I know is that it felt completely real. And it's an experience I'll never forget. One experience has stayed with me for years because of one detail that I still haven't been able to explain. Even now, I don't automatically think it was anything paranormal. Dreams can feel incredibly real, especially when you're only partly asleep. And our brains are capable of creating experiences that seem completely convincing. Still, this one has always been different from any other dream I've ever had. At the time, I was dating my ex-girlfriend. One weekend, we stayed overnight at her grandparents' house. It was an older home, and because the air conditioning wasn't working at the time, everyone slept with the windows open. A large box fan had been placed in the bedroom window to help circulate the air during the night. Other than that, everything about the evening was completely ordinary. We talked for a while before going to bed, and eventually I fell asleep. Sometime during the night, I had one of the strangest dreams I've ever experienced. Calling it a dream almost doesn't feel accurate, because it seemed more like I was awake. In the dream, I wasn't lying in bed. I was standing beside it. I could clearly see the room exactly as it actually looked. The furniture was in the right place. The window was open, The box fan was sitting exactly where we'd placed it before going to sleep. Then, I looked toward the bed. I saw myself lying there asleep. For a moment, I simply stared. The whole experience felt incredibly realistic. It almost reminded me of the descriptions people sometimes give of out-of-body experiences, although I have no idea whether that's what it actually was. Then, I noticed my ex. She wasn't asleep. She was lying on her side, facing away from me. The light from her phone illuminated part of the bed as she looked at the screen. I remember thinking how ordinary everything seemed. Then, something changed. The bedroom door slowly opened. A woman walked into the room. She appeared pale, almost surrounded by a soft gray mist. She wore white clothing that seemed to blend into the faint haze around her. She wasn't rushing. She simply walked calmly through the doorway. At first, I wasn't frightened. I was mostly confused. I remember asking her who she was. I spoke more than once, but she never answered. It was as though she couldn't hear me, or perhaps she simply chose to ignore me. Without acknowledging me at all, she continued walking toward the bed. She slowly circled around to my ex's side. Then she leaned down to look closely at her. I couldn't clearly see every detail of her face, but I had the distinct impression that she was smiling. That was the moment the dream stopped feeling merely strange and became genuinely unsettling. Then she did something that completely terrified me. She started climbing into the bed. At that point, panic took over. I immediately began shouting at her. I repeatedly told her that she wasn't welcome. I ordered her to leave. I also tried desperately to get my ex's attention. I kept calling out to her, hoping she'd wake up and somehow see what I was seeing. She never reacted. The woman paused. For several seconds, she remained completely still. Then, without saying a single word, she stepped away from the bed. She turned around and calmly walked back toward the bedroom door. I remember feeling an enormous sense of relief. I thought the dream was finally over. Then, I looked toward the open window. Standing outside was the same woman. She was looking through the window toward the room. The box fan sat directly between us. For a brief moment, it looked as though she was about to reach toward it. For reasons I still don't understand, that frightened me even more than anything that had happened inside the bedroom. I immediately started yelling again. This time I was shouting threats and every curse word I could think of, demanding that she leave. Everything happened incredibly fast after that. Suddenly, I heard someone calling my name. The dream vanished instantly. I opened my eyes. My ex was shaking me awake. She looked genuinely concerned. The first thing she asked was why I had been talking in my sleep. Apparently, while I was dreaming, I'd actually been mumbling and threatening someone out loud. It had become loud enough that it woke her up. I sat there trying to catch my breath before telling her everything I'd just experienced. I described standing beside the bed. I described seeing her lying on her side. I mentioned that she'd been facing away from me while looking at her phone. The moment I finished saying that, her expression changed. She looked surprised. Then she quietly told me something that immediately gave me chills. She confirmed that before waking me, she really had been lying on her side facing away from me while using her phone. According to her, she'd only put the phone down after hearing me mumbling in my sleep. That detail caught both of us off guard. I hadn't remembered waking up at any point before the dream. As far as I knew, I'd been asleep the entire time. Yet, somehow, my dream had accurately reflected what she was doing before she woke me. I still don't know how to explain that. Maybe I'd briefly opened my eyes without fully waking, and my brain incorporated those real details into the dream. Sleep researchers have documented similar experiences where external events become woven into dreams without the dreamer realizing it. That honestly seems like the most reasonable explanation. Still, the conversation wasn't over. After listening to everything, my ex hesitated before telling me something she'd never mentioned before. She said one of her aunts refused to spend the night in that house anymore. Years earlier, when the aunt was a teenager, she'd been home alone one evening. According to the story, she'd seen a woman dressed in white walking through the hallway. The experience frightened her badly enough that she never wanted to sleep there again. Apparently, no one else in the family had ever reported seeing the same figure. Only the aunt. And now, after hearing my dream, my ex thought my experience sounded strangely similar. I honestly didn't know what to say. There are plenty of ordinary explanations. Dreams borrow details from things we've unconsciously noticed. Sleep paralysis and false awakenings can create incredibly realistic experiences. Stories we hear afterward can also influence how we remember unusual dreams. Those possibilities make far more sense than assuming I'd encountered anything supernatural. Even so, I've never forgotten how vivid that dream felt. I've had countless dreams throughout my life. Almost all of them faded within hours. This one never did. Maybe that's simply because of how realistic it seemed. Or maybe it was because my ex confirmed details that I shouldn't have consciously known while I believed I was asleep. Whatever the explanation, it's still one of the most unusual dreams I've ever experienced. I don't claim it was paranormal. I honestly don't know what it was. I only know that for a few unforgettable moments, it felt as though I was standing in that room, watching everything happen from outside my own body. And even now, years later, I can still picture the woman in white quietly walking through the doorway as clearly as if I dreamed it only last night. I'll rewrite it in smooth, natural English while keeping the story close to the original, preserving the length and atmosphere, and avoiding headings or bold text. People often ask what the scariest thing I've ever experienced was, but that's almost impossible to answer. Fear isn't always something you can explain with words. Some experiences leave you with a feeling that doesn't fit any definition. Trying to describe it is like trying to explain color to someone who has never seen it. You can compare it to other things, but you'll never fully capture what it was really like. This happened when I was about 6 or 7 years old. I was asleep in my bedroom when I suddenly woke up. At least, I thought I had woken up. The room looked exactly as I remembered it, but something was terribly wrong. I couldn't move. Not my arms, not my legs, not even enough to call for my parents. I was completely frozen. At the time, I had no idea what sleep paralysis was. I only knew that I was awake, terrified, and trapped inside my own body. Then I noticed something in the corner of the room. At first it wasn't clear enough to make out. It looked vaguely human, but there were no details. It was more like a dark outline than a person. Even now I couldn't tell you exactly what it looked like, because my eyes never seemed able to focus on it. The strange part wasn't what I saw. It was what I felt. As it slowly moved toward my bed, I could actually feel its presence, not physically touching me, more like the pressure of it. It's difficult to explain, but it felt as though the air itself was becoming heavier with every step it took. I couldn't scream. I couldn't even shut my eyes. I was forced to watch. It kept getting closer. Eventually, I felt something at the foot of the bed. The pressure reached my feet. Then, my ankles, whatever was there hadn't even touched me. Yet I felt as though an enormous weight was slowly surrounding me. The fear became so overwhelming that my mind simply gave up. Everything went black. Then I found myself somewhere else. To this day, more than 30 years later, I still remember every detail of what came next. Most dreams disappear within minutes of waking up. This one never did. It has stayed with me as clearly as if it happened yesterday. I was standing inside what looked like a library. Everything was completely white. The walls were white. The floor was white. The shelves were white. Every single book lining the shelves was perfectly white. None of them had titles. No words. No markings. Nothing. Just endless rows of blank white books stretching into the distance. As I walked forward, my hand brushed across the spines of the books. I wasn't choosing to walk. Something was making me move. I knew I was being forced toward the end of the aisle. In dreams, you sometimes know things without anyone telling you. I somehow knew that something was waiting for me at the end. And I knew I didn't want to see it. Every part of me wanted to turn around. I wanted to run. I wanted to look away. But just like in my bedroom, I couldn't control my own body. The paralysis had followed me into the dream. Step by step, I continued walking. The closer I came to the end of the aisle, the more terrified I became. Finally, I reached the end. Only then was I allowed to turn my head. What I saw has stayed with me my entire life. Standing before me was a large white marble throne. It looked beautiful in every ordinary sense. But above the throne floated something that absolutely wasn't. It looked like a perfect sphere. At first, you'd probably call it black. But that isn't really accurate. It wasn't black the way paint is black. It was more like the complete absence of everything, like a hole cut out of reality itself. The closest comparison I can think of is a black hole. Not because it was pulling in light, but because it seemed to be made from absolute nothingness. Then I felt it. I've never experienced anything like it before or since. The sphere wasn't speaking. It wasn't moving. Yet somehow it was pouring out one overwhelming emotion. Hatred. Not ordinary hatred. Not anger. Pure, complete hatred beyond anything I've ever imagined. It felt alive. It felt intelligent. And somehow I knew exactly what it wanted. I didn't hear words. No voice spoke to me. The thoughts simply appeared inside my mind. Whatever this thing was, it wanted me to suffer. Not just for a moment. Forever, it wanted endless pain. It wanted me to watch my family, the people I loved most in the world, be hurt in front of me simply so I would suffer even more. The feeling wasn't just emotional. It became physical. The hatred was so overwhelming that it felt like it was pressing against every part of me. Again, it became too much. Everything disappeared. Then came the strangest part of the experience. Over the years, every time I've had sleep paralysis, I've felt the same sensation. I've never found words that truly describe it. The closest comparison I can make is standing beside an impossibly deep pool of perfectly black water. You don't know how deep it is. You only know you should never go near it. Or imagine standing inside a completely white room while staring at an endless black void. The contrast itself somehow creates a feeling you can physically experience. That's the closest I've ever come to explaining it. In my dream, that feeling became something almost tangible. It was like a powerful river flowing directly through me. Not water exactly, more like emotion transformed into a rushing current. I somehow understood that I had to push through it. If I could just reach the other side, I'd finally be safe. But at the same time, I knew that safety no longer really existed. It was like trying to return to a place that had already disappeared forever. Even so, I struggled through it. Eventually, after what could have been seconds or hours, everything changed again. Suddenly, I was somewhere dark, much darker than before. I was completely alone. I remember screaming at the top of my lungs. I kept calling for my mom. Eventually, she came into my room. Like any mother, she tried comforting me. She told me everything was okay. She said it had only been a bad dream. She encouraged me to calm down and go back to sleep. For a few minutes, everything seemed normal again. Then she left my room. Only a few moments later, she suddenly came rushing back. This time, she looked completely different. She wasn't calm anymore. She looked terrified. As a little kid, seeing my own mother panic frightened me even more than the nightmare itself. If the adult who was supposed to make everything better was scared, then something had to be terribly wrong. I started crying even harder. She immediately began praying, not quietly, out loud, over and over. She kept saying things like, "Leave this house. Get out. In the name of Jesus, leave." She sounded frightened. But she also sounded angry. The praying continued for quite a while. I don't think anyone in the house slept much for the rest of that night. As the years passed, the memory slowly faded. It never disappeared completely, but it became something I rarely thought about. Then, when I was around 17, something unexpected happened. I was watching television one afternoon when a documentary about sleep paralysis came on. As the program described the symptoms, memories I hadn't thought about in years came rushing back all at once. It felt as though someone had opened a door I'd forgotten existed. Later that day, I asked my mom something I'd wondered about ever since I was a child. Why had she come back into my room so frightened? Why had she started praying so desperately only after she'd left? For a moment, she didn't answer. Then, she said that, when I was little, she hadn't wanted to tell me because I was already terrified, and she thought it would only make things worse. She said I was old enough to know now. And then she finally told me what had made her run back into my room that night. Even now, that's the part of the story I think about the most. If you want this adapted for a YouTube horror narration, I can also expand it to 2500. 3,000 plus words with slower pacing, stronger suspense, and a cinematic storytelling style for a US audience.